In honor of Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, we'll be looking at a prominent Latin American community composed of individuals of Asian descent. Today, we'll be observing the history of Japanese Peruvians, who currently make up a population of over 100,000 people in Peru. ¿Qué onda? Soy Sebastián y bienvenidos a Otomi. In Otomi, we look at all aspects of Latin American society, from racial diversity to musical genres, to linguistic variations, to hybrid religions, to the history of minority communities. As a Hispanic American, I find it essential that we explore these topics. In Otomi, we discuss it all. Thanks for listening into this episode, and I hope you enjoy it. But let's get into this. So the history of the Japanese Peruvian community begins in 1899, when the first Japanese ship, the Sakura Maru, landed on the shores of Callao, Peru, with 790 Japanese laborers with hopes of working in Peru's coastal sugar plantations. So now I have no doubt that you're probably asking, why of all places would Japanese laborers go to work in Peru? It seems like a major inconvenience. They have to go halfway across the world. It's far and culturally very different to Japan. They have to voyage for 40 days overseas and cross the Pacific Ocean. It seems inconvenient, right? Well, Peru was largely targeted as a destination by Japan because of its position as the first Latin American nation to have entered diplomatic relations with an Asian country. This occurred during the Meiji period that lasted from 1868 to 1912. The Meiji rulers sought to westernize their farmers by sending them to Latin America. Peru at the time was having an agricultural boom, so this was a perfect opportunity for the young farmers to flourish and find prosperity. Many of these immigrants were from places like Okinawa or Hiroshima. As mentioned, the first Japanese ship arrived with 790 farmers, who were all males, in 1899. Each laborer had a 4-year contract to work in the plantations. These coastal plantations had a very wide range, with their range going from the northern city of Lambayeque to Cañete in the south. From 1899 to 1941, about 30,000 Japanese individuals traveled to Peru with the hope of eventually returning to their home country of Japan when their contracts were over. An additional wave of immigrants crossed the Pacific during this period as well. They were the families of these workers. They also significantly increased the population of Japanese immigrants within Peru. And as I've mentioned, many of the immigrants had the intent of returning to Japan after working their 4-year contracts in Peru. However, the reality is that many of the Japanese immigrants were unable to return home. Geography created its boundaries. This journey was a whole 40 days long. People of severe illness and old age simply were unable to make the journey. Many perished in Peru, but many were also happy to stay there for the rest of their lives because they had established a community. And many now had family there. Their lives were more comfortable and pleasant in Peru, at least for many of them, than back in Japan. Clearly, this was an incentive to make the long journey. Once their contracts were up, many of the Japanese Peruvian citizens created their own shops and businesses. They went from the plantations of the countryside to the cities. Today, the prevalence of Japanese Peruvians within the industrial and business sector is significant. What were originally small businesses Farms and shops have grown to become large corporations and companies of influence. Within the industrial, agricultural, and business sector of society, Japanese Peruvians continue to be significant. What were originally small businesses, farms, and shops have grown to become large corporations and companies of influence. However, the Second World War created a division in Japanese Peruvian history. The entry of the Empire of Japan into the alliance of the Axis powers, alongside Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, was detrimental to Japanese relations with Peru and much of the Western world. There were programs of deportation and discrimination during the time. Anti-Japanese sentiment was largely influenced by American views on Japanese immigrant communities. There were cases where Peruvian police would round up members of the Japanese Peruvian community and turn them in to American authorities. These American authorities would then send them to internment camps in the United States. American xenophobia was far-reaching in its influence, and it definitely trickled into Latin American politics during the war. 1,800 Japanese Peruvians were sent to the United States, with the first ship leaving on April 2nd of 1942 from the city of Callao. This affected not only Japanese Peruvians, but also other Latin Americans of Japanese descent. Another nation that continues to have a prominent Japanese population is Brazil. Now, by the end of the imprisonment program in 1944 in the United States, when it finally ended, 2,264 Japanese Latin Americans, who were in total citizens of 12 different Latin American nations, had been imprisoned in the United States. About 1,000 of them were deported back to war-torn Japan, a nation that many of them had never even been to before. And later, many of them were not admitted back to their Latin American country of origin. Regardless, the Japanese Peruvian community persevered and showed their resilience. Today, Peru has the second largest population of citizens of Japanese descent in Latin America. In first place is Brazil, with the largest population, but we'll keep the history of Japanese descendant Brazilians for another episode. The number of Japanese Peruvians has surpassed the 100,000 population mark, with some reports showing that Japanese Peruvians compose approximately 1.4% of Peru's population at about 160,000 people. Despite this, only about 22,000 Peruvians self-report having Japanese ancestry, and this is from the 2017 Peruvian census. Now, Japanese Peruvians have had a huge impact on Peruvian food and culture. Also, they've had a big impact on politics. Latin America's first president of Japanese descent was Alberto Fujimori. He was president from 1990 to 2000 and directed a self-coup, or autogolpe, which is sometimes even called a Fujigolpe, in 1992, which gave him dictatorial and authoritarian power. His actions were condemned by most other nations, as he purged political opponents. However, his downfall came when he was accused of corruption and human rights abuses, causing him to flee to Japan for refuge. Eventually, he was extradited by the Chilean government in 2007 to Peru and tried for his crimes, including the forced and coerced sterilization of over 250,000 indigenous Peruvian women over a total of 4 years, from 1996 to 2000. He was given a maximum prison sentence of 25 years. When Peru's president, Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, granted him a pardon in 2017, Peru's Supreme Court overturned the pardon and sent him back to jail. While Fujimori is not an example of a positive role model or a good leader, he is a reflection of the true influence and power that people of Japanese descent have in Latin America. Even his daughter, in the past, I believe 10 years ago, she was trying to run for political power. And I believe that she was formerly a congresswoman. And in Peru specifically, Japanese Peruvians are one of the largest and most influential minority groups. So thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please celebrate this Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And I hope that this helped and gave you some perspective on Asian influences in Latin America, which are definitely prevalent.